The first sign of the vanished world is not stone, bone, or a footprint. It is wood, darkened by time, lying beneath meters of clay where the southern shore of an ancient lake once breathed with monsoon rain. Roughly 300,000 years ago, in what is now Yunnan province in southwestern China, someone carries a shaped branch across wet ground. The object is practical rather than ceremonial. Its surface has been scraped, its end deliberately formed, and its size suited to work performed close to the earth. Perhaps it probes soft mud. Perhaps it loosens a buried tuber or separates tangled roots. Then it is left behind. Water rises, sediment settles, and oxygen disappears from the clay. Against almost every expectation of archaeology, the wood does not vanish. The place is called Gantangqing, near the southern margin of the ancient Lake Fuxian basin. Today, its buried layers offer no picturesque cave chamber and no recognizable village floor. The setting was open air, a changing lakeshore of mud, shallow water, wetland vegetation, patches of woodland, scrub, and grass. People returned to this margin more than once, leaving traces in several layers rather than in one perfectly preserved afternoon. Their visits occurred across an immense interval that researchers have modelled at approximately 361,000 to 250,000 years ago. Calling the tools 300,000 years old is useful shorthand, but it should not be mistaken for a single exact date shared by every object. What survives is not one abandoned camp caught in an instant. It is a scattered record of repeated human activity, compressed beneath a landscape that kept changing. Among those traces are 35 wooden implements, 32 show deliberate modification at a tip, working edge, or base, and 23 have pointed ends. Some are small enough for one hand, 2 are large, heavy digging sticks that may have required both hands. 4 have hook-shaped forms that could have helped cut, catch, or separate roots. One small lozenge-shaped object, only about 7.8 centimeters long, may have functioned as an awl or a tool for teasing plant matter apart. There are rounded points, chisel-like blades, ridged tips, and complete handheld implements. Most were made from pine, although a smaller number used hardwood. Bark survives on only one specimen, a quiet reminder that even within exceptional preservation, most original surfaces have been altered or lost. None has been identified as a projectile, and none should be presented as a wooden hunting spear. Their importance rests in routine labour digging, probing, grubbing, levering, cutting, and perhaps gathering foods hidden beneath the surface. Scraping marks record the removal and shaping of wood. Deliberate polishing appears on some surfaces. Parallel grooves, adhering soil, worn areas, and use-related fractures suggest repeated contact with earth and vegetation. Starch traces and residues strengthen the interpretation that underground plant resources were among the targets, although exact functions remain probable rather than certain. No single explanation fully accounts for every form, and an ancient tool can serve several purposes over its working life. Around the tool users, the lakeshore offers a dense seasonal pantry. Pine nuts, hazelnuts, wild fruits, edible herbs, fern fronds, and aquatic plants grow across the mosaic environment. Below ground lie tubers, rhizomes, corms, and other storage organs, concentrated packages of energy protected by soil and often available when more visible foods become scarce. Reaching them efficiently requires more than finding a convenient stick. A worker must recognize plants, understand what lies below, Choose suitable wood, shape a working end, and judge when wet ground is soft enough to open without destroying the food. Monsoon rains and fluctuating lake levels continually rearrange access. Planned returns to productive patches are plausible, though the evidence does not reveal schedules, ownership, or the precise organization of the group. Nor does plant gathering make these people vegetarian. Cut-marked animal bones at Gantangqing indicate a broader subsistence economy, one in which meat and plant foods could both matter: rhinoceros, turtles, birds, and other animals inhabited or visited the surrounding landscape. The presence of diving ducks suggests that portions of the lake reach depths of at least 2 or 3 meters. Warm, humid, tropical or subtropical conditions, reconstructed from pollen and plant fossils, did not make life effortless. Resources shifted with rainfall, shorelines advanced and retreated, and wetlands could be rich in one season and difficult in another. What survives in the record suggests adaptable people who understood a complicated environment, but it does not justify turning them into modern botanists or assigning them abilities the evidence cannot demonstrate. Their identity is entirely unresolved. No hominin fossil lies beside the tools. No ancient DNA or diagnostic protein identifies the hands that shaped them. They cannot securely be called Homo erectus, Denisovans, Homo sapiens, Homo longi, or members of a newly invented species. Middle Pleistocene Asia contained human populations whose relationships remain among the most difficult problems in paleoanthropology, and a named maker would offer a satisfying face for the story. Gantangqing refuses that satisfaction. It preserves behavior more clearly than biology hand without bones, choices without names, knowledge without a surviving voice. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Stone endures so reliably that the Paleolithic is usually told through flakes, cores, and hand axes. Wood decays, fiber collapses, bark, cordage, baskets, handles, and digging tools normally return to soil, taking entire systems of skill with them. At Gantangqing, low oxygen, waterlogged, clay-rich sediments interrupted that disappearance. Rapid but gentle burial protected objects that elsewhere would have survived only for years or decades. The lake did not preserve an entire culture, but it opened a narrow window into the missing half of its technology. The stone assemblage can appear modest, and large stone tools are scarce nearby, while some raw materials were brought from elsewhere. Yet stone was not working alone. 4 antler billets or soft hammers point toward a multi-material toolkit, and the wooden implements reveal planning that a stone-only record would conceal. Apparently simple technology may therefore be a preservation illusion. The 35 pieces do not prove a formal wood age, much less a wooden civilization. They show something subtler and more consequential: an ancient population built parts of daily life from materials archaeology is least able to recover. A shaped point presses into damp soil. A heavy stick levers something edible from beneath the mud. A hooked implement separates roots. Then people leave, carrying most of their tools with them, while a few remain where water and clay can claim them. Across the ancient world, countless comparable objects decay unseen. Here, a rare sequence of burial preserves 35 exceptions. It asks how much human ingenuity has been mistaken for absence simply because its preferred materials were never given the chance to endure. The survival of wood at Gantangqing is remarkable, but recognition did not come in a single dramatic moment. The site first entered the archaeological record in 1984 when traces of ancient activity were identified in the Fuxian Basin. An initial excavation followed in 1989. Stone artifacts, animal remains, and evidence of a deeply buried lakeshore made the locality important, yet the full significance of its organic material was not immediately clear. Waterlogged pieces of ancient wood can resemble roots, naturally broken branches, or dark stains in sediment. Before any fragment can become a tool, archaeologists must establish that it belongs to the ancient layer, that its form was altered by human hands, and that the apparent working traces were not produced by pressure, decay, excavation, or movement in wet ground. The mystery therefore remained beneath the surface long after Gantangqing was first found. Renewed excavations in 2014 and 2015, followed by further work in 2018 and 2019, opened a more detailed view of the buried sequence. 4 trenches, covering approximately 64 square meters in total, descended through deposits roughly 3.5 to 7 meters deep. These were not broad exposures of an ancient settlement. They were narrow windows cut vertically into a complicated accumulation of clay, silt, sand, organic remains, and archaeological material. Each change in color, texture, grain size, or fossil content could represent a shift in water level, erosion, vegetation, or the manner in which material reached the shore. Excavating such deposits requires patience. Stone can often be recognized by its fracture patterns while still partly embedded, but saturated wood demands a different kind of attention. Its surface may be soft, compressed, cracked, or covered with sediment. Removing it too quickly can destroy the very marks needed to interpret it. Researchers must expose each piece gradually, record its position and orientation, support it during lifting, and prevent uncontrolled drying. Once water leaves ancient wood, weakened cells can shrink and deform. The object that survived hundreds of thousands of years underground may begin changing within hours unless it is handled under carefully controlled conditions. Context is as important as preservation. A pointed branch found alone is ambiguous because natural processes frequently produce sharp ends. Trees split during storms, branches abrade against sediment, roots grow through soil, decay, and break. Water transports wood, while pressure from overlying deposits flattens and fractures it. At Gantangqing, however, the argument for human manufacture does not depend on one suspiciously convenient shape. It emerges from a patterned assemblage. 32 of the 35 implements preserve deliberate modification at their tips, working edges, or bases, repeated scraping, smoothing, polishing, grooving, and shaping appear in locations suited to holding or using the objects. Many pieces belong to recognizable functional forms rather than a random collection of splinters. Their association with other archaeological evidence strengthens the case. Stone artifacts occur within the same broad sequence, together with 4 antler billets or soft hammers, animal bones, plant remains, and traces of repeated activity. Some stone raw materials were not locally available, implying that people carried them into the lakeshore zone. Cut marks on animal bones record another kind of purposeful work. The wooden objects are therefore not isolated curiosities placed in an otherwise natural deposit. They sit within an archaeological landscape where humans brought materials, processed resources, used tools, and left portions of their equipment behind. Even so, researchers had to separate manufacture from use. A scraped surface may show how bark or outer wood was removed, while a polished zone near an end may record repeated contact with soil or hands. Parallel grooves can result from working motions, and fractures at a tip may develop when the implement is pressed, twisted, or levered against resistance. Adhering residues provide another line of evidence. Soil trapped on working areas and traces consistent with plant processing support the interpretation that several tools entered the ground repeatedly. No one mark proves an exact function, but multiple independent clues can converge upon a probable history. The site's plant and animal fossils supply the environmental setting in which that history makes sense. Pollen indicates warm, humid tropical or subtropical conditions. Preserved vegetation points to woodland, scrub, grassland, wetlands, and open water existing close together. Seeds, nuts, fruits, herbs, ferns, and aquatic plants reveal resources that could draw people back to the shore. Diving ducks indicate that parts of the ancient lake were not merely marshy puddles, but reached depths of at least 2 or 3 meters. Rhinoceros, turtles, birds, and other animals occupied this shifting mosaic. The finds belong to an active ecosystem, not a timeless background arranged around human tools. As the excavations progressed, the wooden assemblage began to reveal internal variety. Large implements could be distinguished from smaller handheld pieces. Rounded points differed from ridged tips and chisel-like working edges. 4 hook-shaped tools formed an unusual group, while 2 heavy digging sticks suggested forceful two-handed work. The smallest distinctive implement, a lozenge-shaped piece approximately 7.8 centimeters long, might have served as an awl or helped separate roots. 23 pointed implements demonstrated that a pointed form was repeatedly useful, but similar shapes need not have performed identical tasks. This distinction matters because early wooden discoveries are easily forced into familiar categories. A long point can become a spear in the imagination before its wear, dimensions, and context are examined. At Gantangqing, none of the objects has been identified as a projectile or wooden hunting weapon. The strongest interpretation instead centers on digging, probing, grubbing, and extracting underground plant foods. Hooked pieces may have cut or separated roots, while small tools could work within dense soil or vegetation where a larger stick was awkward. Scholars still debate their precise uses, and some implements may have changed functions during their lives. Recognition also depended on understanding why the assemblage survived. The wood was buried in clay-rich, waterlogged sediment where oxygen became scarce. Rapid but relatively gentle deposition protected surfaces without the tumbling and abrasion expected in a high-energy river channel. Several layers preserved organic material, indicating favorable conditions at more than one point in the site's long history. This was not one catastrophic burial of a complete toolkit. People visited the lakeshore repeatedly, and separate episodes were eventually compressed into a vertical sequence. The 35 implements represent survivors from that larger pattern. Not everything carried or made there. The importance of the collection became widely established with its publication in Science in 2025. By then, decades separated the site's discovery from the full presentation of its wooden technology. That delay reflects the difficulty of the evidence rather than a lack of consequence. Researchers had to connect excavation records, microscopic traces, botanical identifications, sedimentary observations, tool forms, residues, and several dating methods. The resulting interpretation remains careful. Most pieces was intentionally shaped, Several were probably used to obtain plant resources. Exact tasks cannot always be recovered, and the makers remain unknown. Gantangqing was almost overlooked in a deeper sense as well. Had its clay admitted more oxygen? Had the shore been disturbed more violently? Or had archaeologists encountered only the associated stone? The site would have told a thinner story. The digging sticks, hooks, and pointed tools would have decayed, leaving no empty outlines to announce their absence. A modest stone assemblage might then have seemed to measure the limits of local technology. Instead, 35 pieces of wood emerged from the sediment and exposed the flaw in that assumption. Their discovery was not simply the recovery of rare objects, it was the recognition of an entire category of behavior that prehistory usually erases before anyone can notice it is there. That flaw reaches far beyond one lakeshore. Archaeology names the deep human past with materials that survive Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age. The labels are useful, but survival quietly masquerades as importance. Stone remains recognizable after frost, flood, and burial. Wood feeds fungi and insects, burns, splinters, or becomes indistinguishable from debris. In warm, humid environments like ancient Yunnan, decay is especially efficient. Unless burial rapidly excludes oxygen and stabilizes moisture, a wooden implement may disappear while the stone flake that shaped it endures. The archive is therefore not a neutral collection of ancient behavior. It is a selection made by chemistry. Imagine the same group visiting the Lake Fuxian shore under different conditions. They arrive with digging sticks, wooden wedges, bark containers, stone flakes, and antler tools. They gather plant foods, maintain equipment, process an animal carcass, and depart. If the ground remains aerated, nearly everything organic decays. Centuries later, perhaps only stone pieces and fragmented bones remain. Archaeologists may correctly describe stone reduction and animal processing, yet miss the activities that occupied most hands and hours. The interpretation is incomplete in a systematic direction. Wood offers qualities that stone cannot. It is light enough to carry, resilient under strain, warm in the hand, and available in shapes already close to the desired tool. A straight branch can become a probe or digging implement with limited cutting. A fork can provide a hook. A broad piece can serve as a paddle, tray, wedge, or working surface. Different species vary in hardness, flexibility, weight, grain, and resistance to splitting. Choosing pine for many Gantangqing implements may partly reflect local availability, but selection also involves practical judgment. A suitable tree or fallen branch is not merely raw material. It is a bundle of mechanical properties recognized through experience. Manufacture can be deceptively demanding. The maker must cut or break a piece to useful length, remove twigs and bark where necessary, scrape uneven surfaces, and form an end that will survive repeated pressure. Grain direction matters. A point shaped carelessly across the fibers may split. One worked with the fibers can remain strong. A heavy two-handed digging stick must balance leverage against weight. A small pointed implement must be narrow enough to enter resistant soil but stout enough not to snap. Hooks require retaining a natural curve or deliberately shaping one without weakening it. The finished forms at Gantangqing preserve decisions that a simple label such as stick does not capture. This flexibility makes missing wood especially consequential. Stone artifacts frequently record only part of a production chain. A flake may have cut a branch, stripped bark, sharpened a point, or fitted a wooden handle, but the softer partner is gone. a small stone edge can seem unimpressive, even though it created or maintained a much larger implement. Hafting transforms a modest stone piece into a knife, adze, or composite point. Cordage can bind elements, while adhesives can stabilize them. These possibilities should not be assumed at Gantangqing without evidence, yet they show why complexity cannot be measured by the visual drama of surviving stone. The 4 antler billets or soft hammers found in the sequence deepen this lesson. Antler behaves differently from stone and wood, allowing controlled percussion in some kinds of tool production. Alongside transported stone raw materials and shaped wooden implements, it points to technological choices spread across several substances. This is not evidence of an industry in the modern sense, nor proof that every object belonged to one unified toolkit. The finds come from multiple layers spanning a long interval. Still, what survives in the record suggests that the people who returned to the shore did not divide their world into an age of stone and an age of wood. They used materials according to what each could do. The phrase Wood Age can therefore be illuminating if treated as a metaphor, not a formal archaeological period. It challenges the instinct to equate durability with dominance. Early humans almost certainly lived among wooden objects long before metal appeared, just as recent foraging communities have made essential equipment from plant materials. But analogies with recent peoples cannot fill every prehistoric gap, and Gantangqing does not authorize an inventory of vanished baskets, shelters, boats, traps, or furniture. Those objects are possible categories within the broader missing archive, not discoveries at this site. Scientific restraint matters most precisely where imagination has so much room to move. Even the 35 surviving implements form a filtered sample. Tools carried away cannot be counted. Objects deposited where oxygen remained available vanished. Delicate fibers, leaves, bark, and thin wooden pieces were less likely to endure than sturdier forms. Excavation exposed only about 64 square meters of a much larger ancient landscape, and the deepest trench reached through layers accumulated under changing conditions. The assemblage is not a complete cabinet of everything made or used. It is what happened to enter favorable sediments within the areas investigated and then remained identifiable after hundreds of millennia. This is why absence must be handled carefully. No preserved wooden implement at an ordinary site does not mean no wooden technology existed there. At the same time, preservation bias cannot excuse claims unsupported by traces. Archaeologists must work between 2 errors, imagining an elaborate organic world without evidence, or assuming that the durable remainder represents the whole. Gantangqing offers rare leverage because it turns a general suspicion into a material fact. Here are shaped points, hooks, edges, bases, wear, residues, and fractures, physically associated with the lakeshore where plant resources could be reached below ground. The discovery changes how apparent simplicity is read, especially where early stone assemblages contain small flakes and few imposing bifacial tools. Such collections were once arranged along ladders of advancement devised from records elsewhere. Yet a person using a modest flake to prepare a strong digging stick may solve a practical problem more effectively than someone carrying a magnificent hand axe. Technological success depends on function, landscape, and knowledge, not on how an artifact looks in a museum. Scholars still debate how widely organic tool systems varied across Pleistocene Asia, because exceptional sites are too few to reveal the normal pattern. At the ancient shore, wood finally survives beside stone instead of remaining invisible. The relationship reverses the usual emphasis. Stone becomes evidence not only of cutting stone or flesh, but of working substances that disappeared. The wooden tools expose the boundaries of archaeological language. They remind us that the record is assembled from what decay failed to take, and that ingenuity guarantees no permanence. Gantangqing does not replace a Stone Age with a newly invented Wood Age. It makes the picture less comfortable and more human, a world of many materials, reduced by time to its hardest fragments, with 35 improbable exceptions resting in clay. Once wood enters the story, time becomes the next difficulty. The objects at Gantangqing look immediate enough to imagine in a hand, yet their age cannot be read from their surfaces. They were recovered from a deep stack of deposits at the southern margin of the ancient Lake Fuxian basin, where shorelines advanced, wetlands formed, and sediment accumulated through changing conditions. Every tool belongs not merely to a depth, but to a geological context. To determine when people used this shore, researchers had to date the surrounding sequence and ask whether each layer remained in place, whether grains had been reworked, and whether different clocks agreed. The familiar method of radiocarbon dating offers no solution here. Radiocarbon measures the decay of carbon-14 in once-living material, but its practical reach is only a small fraction of Gantangqing's age. By the time an object is hundreds of thousands of years old, too little measurable carbon-14 remains for a dependable date. The wooden implements were therefore not directly radiocarbon dated. Their antiquity comes from the sediments and associated material around them, evaluated through several independent techniques. This distinction matters. A date attached to an archaeological layer is not the same as a laboratory reading taken directly from the tool, even when the context is strong. One central method was infrared stimulated luminescence dating of individual feldspar grains. Mineral grains can store energy generated by natural radiation after burial. Exposure to daylight releases much of that stored signal, effectively resetting a clock. Once a grain is covered and darkness returns, energy begins accumulating again. In the laboratory, infrared stimulation releases the trapped energy as light, allowing researchers to estimate how long the grain has remained buried. In simplified terms, the measurement asks when sediment last saw sufficient sunlight before it settled over the ancient shore. Lakeshore deposits make that question complicated. Some grains may have been fully exposed during transport. Others may have retained an older signal because muddy water or rapid burial shielded them from light. Dating grains one by one helps reveal mixtures that a bulk sample could blur together. A cluster can indicate the most likely depositional age, while outlying grains may preserve incomplete resetting, or older material moved into a younger layer. The method still depends on assumptions about environmental radiation and signal behavior, so its results are expressed with uncertainties rather than as calendar appointments. A second clock came from an associated mammal tooth through electron spin resonance combined with uranium series dating. Tooth enamel accumulates trapped electrons under natural radiation, while uranium entering the tooth after burial affects the dose it receives. Because uranium uptake can change over time, the two techniques are used together to model that history more realistically. The tooth does not date a human act by itself, and it certainly does not name the toolmaker. It provides another chronological constraint within the archaeological sequence, one governed by different physical processes from luminescence. Paleomagnetic evidence added a further line of control. Sediments and minerals can preserve information about Earth's magnetic field when they form or settle. Measurements through a stratigraphic sequence can test whether layers fit the known broad history of magnetic behavior, and can help identify contradictions that a single method might miss. Paleomagnetism rarely supplies a neat day, or even a narrow century in such a setting. Its value lies in independent comparison, helping researchers judge whether the proposed order and antiquity of the deposits are geologically plausible. The results were then interpreted with stratigraphy and Bayesian age modelling. Stratigraphy supplies the basic sequence unless layers have been disturbed. Lower deposits formed before those above them. Bayesian modelling combines dated samples, their uncertainties, and that known order to calculate age estimates that are consistent with the evidence as a whole. It does not manufacture precision from weak information. Rather, it prevents each measurement from floating alone and makes the assumptions connecting them explicit. The final model places the archaeological layers containing wooden and stone implements within a broad interval of approximately 361,000 to 250,000 years ago. That range explains both the power and the limits of the phrase 300,000 years old. It gives the public a memorable scale and correctly places Gantangqing deep in the Middle Pleistocene. But it rounds a long sequence into a single number. The 35 implements didn't all fall onto the shore in 1 year, 1 season, or 1 human lifetime. They occur across several layers, and the dated sequence may span more than 100,000 years. Some layers preserved organic material better than others. Some visits may be separated by intervals far longer than the entire history of a modern city. The 4 trenches make that vertical history visible in narrow slices. Together they covered about 64 square meters, descending between roughly 3.5 and 7 meters depending on location. Within them, changes in clay, silt, sand, fossils, and organic preservation mark different episodes in the life of the basin. A quieter margin might collect fine sediment and plant matter. A shift in water level could expose ground, drown vegetation, or move the productive zone elsewhere. Monsoon rainfall altered runoff, while longer climatic changes reshaped the balance among open water, marsh, woodland, scrub, and grassland. For wooden tools to survive, burial had to be quick enough to protect them yet gentle enough not to destroy their surfaces. Fine, clay-rich sediment settled around some objects in low energy, waterlogged conditions. As oxygen was consumed and not readily replaced, the organisms responsible for decay became less effective. This did not preserve every item perfectly. Wood compressed, surfaces changed, and most bark disappeared. Yet scraping marks, shaped ends, grooves, polish, and use-related damage remained legible on enough pieces to establish deliberate workmanship. Nothing requires one sudden disaster. There is no need to imagine a village overwhelmed in a single flood or a complete toolkit abandoned during catastrophe. Repeated activity beside a fluctuating lake, followed by ordinary episodes of sedimentation, accounts more closely for the pattern. A tool lost in soft ground during one visit might be sealed beneath clay. Many generations later, another person could work at a shoreline formed above it. The lake basin became an archive through accumulation, not a snapshot through destruction. This layered chronology, presented with the assemblage's wider significance in the 2025 Science publication, gives Gantangqing its unusual depth. It documents recurring human use of wooden technology across changing shore environments. While refusing the false comfort of one exact date, scholars still debate the resolution of individual episodes, and the evidence remains incomplete. Yet several dating systems, the ordered sediments, and the preservation history converge on the same essential conclusion: long before wood usually has any right to remain visible. People repeatedly came to this ancient margin, worked its resources, and left shaped implements where mud could begin its slow work of remembering. The memory held by that mud begins with movement. Rain arrives across southwestern China, feeding slopes, streams, wetlands, and the broad basin around ancient Lake Fuxian. The shoreline does not remain fixed. During wetter intervals, water spreads over low ground and covers plants rooted in the shallows. When levels fall, exposed mud becomes a working surface crossed by animals and people. Over longer spans, woodland, grass, and scrub shift, while former margins disappear beneath sediment. The people who return to Gantangqing enter a landscape that is familiar in its possibilities, but never permanently arranged. This is not the cold, treeless world often used to symbolize the Pleistocene. Pollen and preserved plant remains indicate warm, humid tropical or subtropical conditions. Pine grows within reach of those selecting wood, but it is only one element in a mosaic that includes broader woodland, scrub, grassland, marshy zones, and open lake water. Habitats meet within a small area, creating variety without guaranteeing constant abundance. Heat and moisture support dense vegetation, yet they also conceal resources, accelerate decay, and make movement through saturated ground difficult. Seasonal monsoon rain governs the rhythm. A productive patch beside the water can be submerged after sustained rainfall. A shallow margin can dry, exposing firmer ground but moving aquatic foods farther away. Streams carry fine sediment into quiet water, and vegetation traps clay and silt. Some of this shifting material eventually seals the wooden objects. To the people using the shore, however, sediment is not an archaeological gift. It is mud underfoot, resistance around buried roots, and a sign of where particular foods may be found. The edible landscape extends in several directions at once. Pine nuts and hazelnuts offer compact stores of energy. Wild fruits ripen above ground, while herbs and fern fronds supply other seasonal possibilities. Aquatic plants occupy shallow water and wet margins. Beneath the surface, tubers, rhizomes, corms, and other underground storage organs hold nutrients out of sight. Soil protects these foods after leaves or stems become less useful. Finding them requires knowledge of subtle markers, the form of a leaf, the place where a stem enters the ground, the moisture preferred by a species, and the season in which the buried portion is worth the labour. Wooden tools convert that knowledge into access. A heavy stick can break resistant soil and provide leverage. A smaller point can probe among roots without opening a large hole. A hook-shaped end may catch, loosen, or separate material below the surface. The reconstruction remains modest. The surviving implements suggest repeated digging and plant extraction. They do not reveal the name of any plant being sought in a particular moment, the division of work, or the route taken to the shore. Detailed ecological familiarity is likely because successful gathering depends upon it. But the evidence does not require modern maps, formal schedules, or an unchanging tradition. Nor is the lakeshore simply a vegetable storehouse. Rhinoceros move nearby, while turtles, birds, and other fauna use land and water. Diving ducks offer one of the quieter surprises in the assemblage. Their presence suggests that parts of the lake reached at least 2 or 3 meters deep, placing substantial open water near the zones where people worked. Cut-marked animal bones show that animal resources entered human activity. Gantangqing therefore records a broad economy rather than vegetarianism or exclusive dependence on plants. What survives in the record suggests flexibility. Different foods, tools, and habitats could become important as conditions changed. Archaeological abundance is not abundance experienced on the ground. Nuts fail in some years. Fruits appear briefly and then vanish. Wetland plants can be rich but scattered. Underground foods may be dependable, yet their value must be weighed against the effort of locating, digging, cleaning, and processing them. Animals also change their movements with water, vegetation, and season. A warm environment can be generous and still demand planning. Familiarity with its cycles reduces uncertainty, but never abolishes it. This helps explain why planned visits to the lake margin are plausible. People may have approached when particular plants were ready, when lowered water exposed useful ground, or when several resources overlapped. Tools could be prepared before arrival, carried from nearby, repaired at the shore, or shaped there from available wood. Non-local stone raw materials indicate movement or exchange across a broader area, although the exact source routes remain uncertain. The two heavy digging sticks would have been more cumbersome than the small handheld points, suggesting that choices about what to carry depended on the intended work. There is no evidence that the shore was a permanent village. No house plan, field system, or fixed settlement should be projected onto the excavated layers. The site is better understood as a repeatedly used place within a larger territory, although even that model remains open to refinement. Groups might have paused briefly, worked for longer periods, or returned at intervals that varied across thousands of generations. The deposits combine traces from multiple visits over an age range so large that the environment itself altered between them. Similar tools in separate layers therefore need not belong to one continuous community. The humans themselves remain physically absent. Their bodies cannot be reconstructed from pollen-worked wood or cut-marked bone, and the warm lakeshore should not be assigned to a species merely because a named population is known elsewhere in Asia. Around 361,000 to 250,000 years ago, the continent contains a complicated mosaic of hominins, much of it represented by fragmentary fossils and uncertain relationships. At Gantangqing there are no hominin fossils, no ancient DNA, and no diagnostic proteins. The landscape can be described more confidently than the people moving through it. Behavior nevertheless leaves an outline. Someone recognizes a suitable length of pine and knows how it will behave under pressure. Someone returns to a wet margin where underground foods can be reached. Stone arrives from beyond the immediate shore. Antler and wood serve alongside it. Tools are lost, discarded, or left after use, and some descend into the oxygen-poor conditions that preserve them. These are not proofs of agriculture, permanent settlement, or uniquely modern cognition. They are signs of anticipation, practical memory, manual skill, and repeated engagement with place. Seen at human scale, Gantangqing is less a static paradise than a series of decisions. Water is high or low. The mud is too soft here and workable there. One branch has the right grain, another will split. A buried plant is worth the effort, while an exhausted patch is left behind. Monsoon clouds gather over the basin, and the edge of the lake changes again. The makers vanish from view, but the choices accumulate beneath their feet. Layer by layer, a living landscape becomes sediment, preserving not a portrait of its inhabitants, but the practical intelligence with which unnamed people learn to return. The choices preserved in the mud begin long before a tool touches soil. Near the ancient shore, a maker searches for wood of suitable length, grain, weight, and resilience. Pine is common in the surviving assemblage, although several implements were made from hardwood. Availability influenced selection, but selection was not random. A branch meant to bear the force of two hands must behave predictably. Knots may strengthen one form and weaken another. A natural curve can become a hook. A straight length can carry pressure into the ground without turning aside. Of the 35 wooden implements recovered at Gantangqing, 32 show deliberate modification at their tips, working edges, or bases. No single pointed stick is enough to demonstrate technology. Branches break naturally, and sediment can polish or abrade them. Here, alteration recurs in patterned places. Ends are rounded, narrowed, ridged, or formed into chisel-like edges. Bases are worked where a tool may have been held or prepared for use. Scraping marks cross surfaces in ways consistent with the removal of bark and outer wood. Only one specimen still carries bark, showing how much even unusually preserved wood can lose. Stone edges probably did this work, although no exact tool can be matched to every mark. A flake drawn along a branch can peel away thin curls, reduce a knot, and gradually bring an end into shape. Repeated strokes leave striations. Harder areas demand different angles or greater pressure. The maker may rotate the piece, inspect the grain, and alter the plan when fibers begin to split. A surviving point is the final geometry of many small corrections. 23 implements have pointed ends, but point does not mean spear. None of the Gantangqing objects has been identified as a projectile or wooden hunting weapon. Their sizes, forms, wear, and lakeshore context instead favour work close to the ground. A rounded point can penetrate soft sediment without immediately splitting. A ridged tip may concentrate force. A chisel-like edge can open compacted soil or cut into plant tissue. Similar forms can overlap in function, and one tool may move from probing to digging, then be resharpened for another task. Archaeological categories aid description. Ancient use was likely less tidy. 2 implements stand apart through their size and weight. They are substantial digging sticks, probably operated with both hands. Imagine leaning into one. The tip enters damp ground. The shaft is twisted or pulled, and a plug of earth loosens around a buried plant. The tool acts as a lever, extending the user's force while keeping hands away from stones, roots, and saturated clay. Such work can generate fractures near the working end and polish surfaces through repeated contact. It can also exhaust a poorly chosen branch quickly. A durable implement requires both suitable wood and shaping that respects its fibers. At the other end of the scale are smaller pieces designed for one-handed work. These could probe among closely packed roots, grub through softened sediment, or extract food after a larger stick opened the ground. Their compact size would allow controlled movements that a heavy shaft could not. One particularly small lozenge-shaped implement measures approximately 7.8 centimeters. It may have served as an awl, or perhaps as a tool for separating roots and plant fibers. The form invites precision, but precision in description must not become false certainty about purpose. 4 hook-shaped implements add another solution. A hook can catch material that a straight point pushes aside. It might pull a root upward, separate intertwined growth, or help cut plant matter by trapping it against an edge. Natural forks or curved branches may have offered starting forms, reducing the amount of wood that had to be removed, yet their exact motions have not survived. The hooks are evidence of intentional shape and probable task specialization, not a complete instruction manual. Their variety suggests that toolmakers responded to different kinds of resistance beneath and around the wetland surface. Microscopic and surface evidence brings these motions closer. Scraping traces indicate manufacture. Deliberately polished areas reflect finishing or repeated handling. Parallel grooves may record working strokes, while soil residues remain attached to parts that entered the ground. Use-related fractures reveal stress accumulated during pressure, twisting, levering, or impact with resistant material. Starch traces and other residues support an association with plant exploitation. No clue stands alone. A fracture can occur after burial. Polish can be produced by sediment, and starch can move through soil. The interpretation becomes persuasive when location, pattern, context, and multiple kinds of evidence agree. Even then, the language must remain probable. Archaeologists can infer that several implements were used for digging and that underground storage organs were likely targets. They cannot say which hand held a particular object, which species of tuber it reached, or whether every groove formed during the same task. Some tools could have served functions that left similar wear. Others may have been unfinished, repaired, reused, or discarded after a break. Experiments with replica implements can show what is mechanically possible, but a successful modern trial does not prove that an ancient person followed the same sequence. Fire offers another temptation. At sites elsewhere, wooden implements preserve evidence of deliberate heating or fire shaping. That knowledge cannot simply be transferred to Gantangqing. The assemblage should not be described as fire-hardened unless diagnostic traces demonstrate it. Scraping and polishing already provide a clear manufacturing story without adding an unsupported stage. The same restraint applies to agriculture. Digging for tubers is not cultivation, and specialized plant-gathering tools do not establish fields, domestication, or permanent settlement. They belong to a mobile or otherwise unknown way of life, whose organization cannot be recovered from these objects alone. What can be recovered is an intimate sequence of practical knowledge. The toolmaker sees useful form inside a branch, chooses where to cut, preserves strength along the grain, and shapes an end for anticipated resistance. The user knows where buried foods are likely to grow and how wet soil changes after rain or falling water. A heavy implement performs one phase of work. A hook or small point may perform another. Stone edges prepare wood. Antler tools participate in the wider technological system, and the finished objects return human effort to the earth. Then the sequence breaks. Most implements are carried away or decay where oxygen can reach them. A few settle into clay, their surfaces protected well enough for scraping marks, polish, grooves, residues, and fractures to remain. They do not reveal a wooden civilization, and they do not identify their makers. They reveal craftsmanship without ornament, technology embedded in food gathering, and repeated solutions to ordinary physical problems. At Gantangqing, wood from ancient trees became tools. Tools entered the lakeshore, and the lakeshore preserved just enough of their shapes to show that stone was never working by itself. What those tools reached beneath the lakeshore was not an accidental supplement to life. Underground storage organs can be dependable foods because their valuable tissues remain hidden. Tubers, rhizomes, corms, and swollen roots store energy that a plant will use for regrowth. Leaves may wither, fruits may disappear, and animals may move beyond reach, while nourishment remains protected below the surface. Yet hidden food is not easy food. Its reliability exists only for people who know where to search and can enter the ground efficiently. At Gantangqing, the evidence draws attention to that partnership between knowledge and equipment. The warm, humid basin offered aquatic plants, herbs, ferns, nuts, fruits, and many other potential resources. Starch traces and soil residues on wooden implements, together with wear consistent with ground contact, suggest that some tools helped obtain plant foods. The two large digging sticks could open resistant earth. Smaller pointed tools may have probed or worked around delicate roots. Hook-shaped pieces might have loosened, caught, or separated underground growth. These functions remain interpretations, but they fit the forms, traces, and environment better than the image of wooden projectiles. Locating an underground plant begins above ground. A gatherer reads stems, leaf shapes, neighboring species, drainage, shade, and soil texture. The same plant may be valuable in one season and thin or toxic in another. Some underground organs require soaking, pounding, heating, peeling, or repeated washing before they are safe or pleasant to eat. None of these particular preparation methods is demonstrated for every resource at Gantangqing, and no preserved recipe survives. Still, successful exploitation would have depended upon distinctions learned through observation and memory. The work may unfold in stages. A long point tests the soil and helps locate resistance. A heavy shaft breaks the surface and levers a compact mass upward. A smaller tool clears sediment without slicing through the desired organ. A hook draws aside tangled roots. Hands remove loosened mud and inspect what has been exposed. This reconstruction does not assign one fixed role to every artifact. It simply shows why a varied set of wooden forms could be useful in the same patch, and why large stone implements were not always the best answer to a lakeshore task. Stone would still matter, and a sharp flake can cut stems, trim damaged tissue, prepare a wooden point, or divide food after extraction. Antler can act as a soft hammer in tool production. Containers made from bark, fibre, hide, or wood would be useful for carrying gathered material, although none should be claimed here without direct evidence. Gantangqing preserves only part of the sequence. What makes the site extraordinary is that its missing organic dimension becomes slightly less missing, allowing stone, antler, and wood to be imagined as interacting materials rather than separate technological stages. Energy explains why this labour could be worthwhile. Underground storage organs often contain carbohydrates, and a productive patch can return more food than the effort required to open it. But returns vary. A tool can break, a plant can be too small, and wet clay can cling heavily to everything it touches. Knowledge reduces wasted effort by directing workers toward the right places at the right times. The wooden assemblage therefore points not merely to objects but to repeated decisions about risk, season, travel, and reward. It hints at a body of a local experience that cannot fossilize in the same way as a shaped tip. That experience might be shared socially. Younger or less experienced group members could watch where others dig, which stems they follow, and how a point is angled to avoid breaking the food. A maker could learn that one wood bends while another splits, or that one end needs reshaping before the next visit. Such learning is a reasonable part of any persistent technology, but the archaeological record does not show who taught whom. It reveals repeated solutions across several layers, not conversations, family structures, or name traditions. The distinction protects a human interpretation from becoming an invented biography. It also prevents gathering from being treated as passive behavior. Older accounts of prehistory often allowed hunting to carry the drama of intelligence, while plant collection remained a vague background activity. Wooden digging technology challenges that imbalance. Extracting hidden foods can require planning, ecological classification, manufactured equipment, coordinated movements, and considerable physical effort. A projectile may leave an obvious story because it resembles a familiar weapon. A worn digging point appears quieter, yet its use may rest upon knowledge accumulated over generations. Gantangqing makes that quieter intelligence archaeologically visible. The correction should not swing into another exaggeration. Cut-marked animal bones show that these people also processed animal resources. They were not demonstrated vegetarians, and the site does not represent a society organized exclusively around tubers. Nor does the presence of digging tools establish agriculture. Cultivation involves relationships among people, plants, landscapes, and reproduction that cannot be inferred simply because someone opens soil. Foragers across many environments dig, prune, burn, carry, and sometimes encourage useful species without becoming farmers in the later archaeological sense. At Gantangqing, the secure claim is exploitation of a varied lakeshore, not domestication. Permanent settlement is equally unsupported. Productive underground foods can encourage return to a location without requiring people to live there continuously. A group might revisit a shore as water levels fall, pass through during a seasonal movement, or use the area at irregular intervals. The archaeological layers span approximately 361,000 to 250,000 years ago, far too long to compress into one stable custom. Similar practical problems may have drawn different generations or populations to the same basin. Continuity of opportunity is not automatically continuity of community. Even the term subsistence can make the activity sound mechanical, as if ancient life were a calculation of calories. Plants also have textures, tastes, odors, and social meanings, though none of those dimensions can be recovered securely here. Gathering can involve attention to weather, companionship, competition, preference, and memory. Archaeology sees the durable consequences: residues, worn surfaces, cut bones, transported stone, and a few wooden forms. The larger experience remains outside the deposit. A careful narrative can acknowledge that richness without pretending to know its details. By late in the day, holes opened in the wet ground may fill slowly with cloudy water. Edible material is carried away, while fragments, broken tools, or implements overlooked in mud remain behind. Rain smooths footprints. Fine sediment gathers around the abandoned wood. In time, the lake margin shifts, vegetation returns, and another surface forms above the first. What begins as ordinary food getting becomes invisible history. Only the unlikely survival of shaped wood allows us to recognize that beneath the familiar stones of the Middle Pleistocene lay another kind of archived knowledge stored in landscapes, movements, and perishable tools, renewed whenever unnamed people learned where the earth was worth opening. The earth worth opening preserves no trace of the faces that bent above it. At Gantangqing, wood, stone, antler, animal bone, pollen, and sediment survive. But no hominin bone has been recovered from the archaeological layers. There is no tooth whose anatomy can be compared with other fossils, no fragment of skull, and no preserved molecule that identifies a lineage. The makers appear only through consequences: a branch selected, a point shaped, a lakeshore revisited, and food drawn from the ground. Their behavior is unusually tangible. Their biological identity is entirely unresolved. That uncertainty is not an empty space waiting for the most familiar name. The relevant deposits formed approximately 361,000 to 250,000 years ago, during the Middle Pleistocene, when Asia was occupied by human populations whose relationships remain uncertain. Across immense distances, fossils often consist of isolated skulls, jaws, teeth, or partial skeletons. Some display combinations of traits that do not fit neatly into a single traditional category. Dates are revised. comparisons change as new specimens appear, and researchers place the same fossil in different branches. Homo erectus is an obvious candidate in the broadest sense. Populations commonly assigned to that name had lived in East Asia for hundreds of thousands of years, and fossils are known from China. Yet Homo erectus was not necessarily one uniform body spread unchanged across a continent. Variation exists among specimens, and scholars disagree about where the boundaries of the species should be drawn. More importantly, regional presence is not site-specific proof. A population known somewhere in China at roughly the right time cannot be placed at Gantangqing without remains connecting it to the tools. Other Middle Pleistocene fossils make the picture more crowded rather than clearer. Crania and partial skeletons from sites such as Dali, Jinyashan, and Hualongdong preserve mixtures of features that have generated competing interpretations. Some have been compared with Homo erectus, some with later humans, and some with lineages that may have developed within Eastern Asia. Their anatomy informs regional evolution, but none provides a label that can simply be carried south and attached to the Gantangqing assemblage. Similar ages do not establish shared identity, and map proximity can conceal ecological and chronological distances. Denisovans offer another tempting answer. Genetic evidence revealed a population related to, but distinct from, Neanderthals, and traces of Denisovan ancestry survive in living people. Fossils and molecular evidence show that Denisovan-related humans occupied parts of Asia, although their range and diversity remain known from a small record. The word Denisovan can therefore sound more visually precise than the evidence permits. At Gantangqing there is no ancient DNA, no diagnostic protein, and no fossil demonstrably tied to that lineage. A broad Asian distribution makes Denisovan involvement possible, not established. Homo sapiens cannot be handled by simple exclusion either. Our species existed in Africa by roughly the beginning of the Gantangqing age range, and early movements beyond Africa remain an active field of research. Claims for the timing and continuity of early Homo sapiens in East Asia are debated, especially when fossils combine traits or lack secure contexts. It would be incorrect to argue that modern humans certainly made the tools, but equally careless to declare that they could not have been present merely because the site is ancient. Gantangqing supplies no anatomical evidence with which to decide the question. There may also be choices that current names fail to capture. A group can leave descendants through mixture, disappear without known descendants, or be represented by fossils not yet discovered. Populations that archaeologists separate for convenience may have exchanged genes, mates, techniques, or territories. Others may have remained isolated for long periods. The human family of the Middle Pleistocene was not a clean procession in which one finished species replaced another on schedule. It was a branching and reconnecting history, observed through a record so incomplete that even the number of populations involved is uncertain. The tools cannot solve that biological puzzle because technology is not a reliable species badge. A digging stick does not contain a taxonomic signature. Different human groups facing similar soil, roots, and plant foods can arrive at similar forms. Knowledge can also move between neighboring populations without their bodies becoming identical. Conversely, members of one lineage can use different technologies in different environments. Assigning species from a tool type risks confusing a practical solution with anatomy. At Gantangqing, pointed, hooked, and chisel-like implements reveal what people did, not what shape their skulls possessed. This distinction becomes important when behavior is used as a ladder of humanity. Planning a visit, selecting wood, maintaining a tool, and recognizing edible plants all require learning and anticipation. Those capacities deserve to be taken seriously. They do not, however, provide a simple test for modernity, language, ritual, or a mind identical to ours. Many human lineages could behave flexibly, and the archaeological record preserves only selected outcomes of thought. The Gantangqing makers were neither mindless figures moved by instinct nor modern people disguised in deep time. They were humans adapted to their own social and ecological world, most of which remains inaccessible. Even the scale of the group is unknown. 35 implements accumulated across multiple layers and perhaps across a span exceeding 100,000 years. They do not represent 35 individuals, a single community, or an uninterrupted local tradition. One person may use several tools, many people may use similar forms, later visitors may independently rediscover the same effective design. Continuity and a working edge can reflect teaching, repeated invention, or simply the limited number of shapes that perform well in wet ground. The deposits preserve recurrence, but not a genealogy of makers. What they do preserve is enough to change the question. Instead of asking which species was advanced enough to make wooden tools, we can ask what kinds of knowledge were useful at this shore and how many human populations may have possessed them. The first framing assumes that intelligence belongs to a name and that an object ranks its maker. The second begins with evidence-modified wood, residues, wear, transported stone, antler billets, cut-marked bone, and a resource-rich landscape. It allows competence to be visible without forcing competence to identify a species. So the makers remain a population without a recovered face. They may eventually be connected to fossils through new excavations, refined dating, proteins, or genetic material from another part of the basin. They may remain permanently beyond classification. For now, every confident portrait exceeds the evidence. Along the ancient Lake Fuxian margin, unnamed hands chose pine and hardwood, watched changing water, and opened the soil. Their bones have not entered the story. The wooden objects have, preserving a rare paradox of prehistory. The most fragile material gives us the clearest view of what these people knew, while the people themselves remain the least visible part of the scene. A population without a recovered face can still generate competing stories. At Gantangqing, the disagreement concerns how much can be carried from surviving shapes into vanished behavior. Were branches deliberately made into tools, or did natural processes create suggestive forms? Were the points used mainly for digging, or for tasks that left similar damage? Does the assemblage represent specialized plant gathering, a multi-purpose toolkit, or a distorted sample from a wider organic world? Each explanation begins with the same 35 objects, yet gives them a different place in human life. The most basic alternative is that some pieces acquired their forms without human intervention. Wood breaks, compresses, decays, and splits along its grain. Roots can smooth surfaces, sediment can abrade ends, and excavation can add damage. Archaeologists therefore cannot identify a tool merely because it resembles one. At Gantangqing, the case for manufacture rests upon repetition and placement. 32 pieces show modification concentrated at tips, edges, or bases, scraping, shaping, polishing, grooves, and fractures occur in combinations suited to manufacture and use. Natural action altered the collection, but does not readily explain the full pattern. Function is harder to settle. A long point invites the image of a spear, especially because early wooden weapons are known elsewhere. Yet resemblance is not proof. No Gantangqing implement has been identified as a projectile, and the strongest evidence leads downward rather than outward. Soil residues adhere to working areas. Tips show stress consistent with entering resistant ground. Heavy two-handed sticks provide leverage, while smaller points and hooks would work around roots. Starch traces support plant interaction. Hunting may have been part of the makers' lives, but these particular objects do not provide convincing evidence of wooden weapons. Even the term digging tool may be too narrow if it suggests one implement performing one motion throughout its life. A point could probe mud, open compacted soil, clear vegetation, and later be resharpened. A hook could pull a root, catch a stem, or separate tangled material. Chisel-like edges may have cut plant tissue or broken earth. Experimental replicas can test which movements reproduce certain traces, but several activities may leave overlapping signatures. The strongest interpretation is therefore functional rather than ceremonial. These objects worked against soil and plants, often in obtaining underground foods, while exact assignments remain provisional. Another explanation turns plant gathering into early agriculture. Digging sticks, repeated visits, and knowledge of productive patches can sound like cultivation when viewed from a farming world. But the necessary evidence is absent. There are no domesticated plants, fields, storage buildings, irrigation works, or demonstrated cycles of planting and harvest. People can revisit wild stands, disturb soil, and influence vegetation without practicing agriculture. The Gantangqing tools show skilled foraging in a resource-rich environment. They do not reveal farmers misplaced by hundreds of thousands of years. Repeated activity also raises the question of settlement. Perhaps the lakeshore held a persistent camp, with tools lost where people lived. Or perhaps groups arrived briefly when season and water level exposed useful resources. The excavated area is too small, and the sequence too long, to map residents. No dwelling plan or permanent village has been found. Transported stone, cut-marked bones, and varied tools show purposeful use of the locality. But a repeatedly visited task area could produce that pattern without year-round occupation. Return does not necessarily mean permanence. Time complicates every explanation. The tools occur in multiple layers dated within approximately 361,000 to 250,000 years ago. They are not one abandoned set left after a single day of work. Similar forms separated vertically may record durable tradition, repeated reinvention, or the mechanical demands of wet soil. A pointed shaft works because its shape concentrates force, regardless of who makes it. Archaeology can recognize recurrence, but it cannot assume that one community, language, or lineage remained beside the lake across more than 100,000 years. This leaves a larger dispute over whether Gantangqing represents regional innovation or a rare fragment of something widespread. If wooden tools were common across Pleistocene Asia, most sites have lost the evidence. Gantangqing would then be exceptional in preservation, not behavior. If the technology was uncommon, it might reflect a local response to wetlands and underground foods. The record cannot distinguish those possibilities securely. The missing archive prevents either possibility from becoming the default, leaving preservation itself at the center of interpretation. Ideas could also spread between neighboring groups, while separate populations might invent similar forms because straight branches, curved forks, and compact points offer the same mechanical advantages. Similarity cannot prove contact, and difference cannot prove isolation. Some interpretations treat the tools as evidence of a mind approaching modernity. Their manufacture certainly involves anticipation, material knowledge, and controlled action. Gathering hidden foods requires ecological memory, and repeated shaping implies learned practice. Yet no wooden point can measure language, symbolic thought, or mental similarity to living humans. Those capacities cannot be ranked from one toolkit, and several Middle Pleistocene populations may have possessed sophisticated practical knowledge. The conclusion is not that an unnamed species crossed an imagined threshold. It is that competence cannot be reserved for whichever human lineage later survived. At the opposite extreme lies the old impression of technological simplicity. A modest stone assemblage can make its makers appear limited if stone is treated as the entire system. Once wood and antler enter the picture, small flakes become a parts of a broader chain tools for preparing tools, maintaining edges, processing food, and modifying materials that vanish. Gantangqing does not prove a hidden wooden civilization. It demonstrates that visible simplicity can be created by decay. What looks like sparse technology may be the durable residue of a richer set of practices. The most defensible explanation is also the least theatrical. Across many visits to a changing lake shore, people selected wood, shaped it deliberately, and used several forms in tasks that included digging and plant exploitation. They worked stone and antler, processed animals, and moved through a wider landscape. The assemblage accumulated through separate episodes rather than one catastrophe. The makers may represent one or several populations, while the tools may preserve tradition, repeated solutions, or both. Uncertainty remains not because the evidence says nothing, but because it says some things clearly while refusing others. Eventually, every proposed story reaches the same boundary. Clay preserves worked surfaces but not spoken explanations. It protects implements while erasing most of the system to which they belonged. Above the buried layers, shorelines move, plants return, and later visitors leave different traces. The technology does not necessarily end when it disappears from view. The conditions that make it visible end. Gantangqing may record the loss of a population, place, or tradition, but it certainly records the loss of evidence, showing how easily living technology passes from ordinary use into archaeological silence that resembles extinction. That resemblance weakens when Gantangqing is placed beside the few other places where ancient wood escaped decay. Across the Pleistocene, people almost certainly cut, carried, sharpened, and combined wood far more often than archaeology can demonstrate. Yet the surviving record is not continuous. It is a scattering of waterlogged pockets, mineralized fragments, and isolated objects, each preserved by accident. Together they do not describe one expanding invention. They reveal several ways humans turn trees and branches into solutions, while emphasizing how much of the map remains blank. At Kalambo Falls in Zambia, waterlogged deposits preserved wood far older than the Gantangqing implements. Among the finds are two pieces arranged across one another, with a cut feature allowing them to interlock. The discovery has been interpreted as part of a platform, foundation, or working surface, although its exact purpose remains uncertain. Other modified pieces include forms interpreted as a wedge, digging stick, cut log, and notched branch. Here wood was not merely a handheld tool. It could become part of an altered place, suggesting that people shaped elements of their surroundings long before permanent architecture. The comparison is powerful because the objects are different. Kalambo Falls does not provide an earlier version of the Gantangqing toolkit, and Gantangqing is not a later step toward construction. One site preserves structural pieces and varied worked wood in an African riverine setting. The other preserves portable implements at an East Asian lakeshore. Both depended on wet sediment and restricted oxygen. Both demonstrate deliberate modification. Beyond that shared foundation, their forms reflect different landscapes, tasks, histories, and perhaps different human populations. Far to the north, Schöningen in Germany preserves another wooden record. Its spears and other pointed weapons are associated with lakeshore activity and the remains of large animals. Study has revealed not only hunting weapons but shorter pieces, throwing implements, and tools that were reshaped, repaired, or recycled. Their workmanship shows control over wood selection, balance, grain, and finishing. These objects make wooden hunting technology visible because waterlogged sediments protected them, not because European humans discovered how to sharpen branches. Schöningen also clarifies why form and context must be read together. A straight, balanced shaft with damage suited to impact presents a different case from a heavy digging stick carrying soil residue. Both may narrow toward a point, but their mass, proportions, wear, and associations lead toward different functions. Gantangqing belongs within the history of wooden technology without becoming another spear site. Its significance lies in expanding the record away from the drama of hunting and toward the repetitive labor of obtaining plants. An isolated object from Clacton-on-Sea in England makes the problem of scale clearer. A wooden point, interpreted as part of a thrusting weapon, survived from around 400,000 years ago. Its existence proves that worked wooden points were present, but one incomplete object cannot reveal the equipment carried by its makers. Was it typical or unusual? Was it one element within a toolkit or a rare implement for a particular encounter? The deposit cannot answer. An assemblage such as Gantangqing offers a different strength. Repeated forms allow patterns to emerge, rather than forcing interpretation to rest upon one survivor. At Spaghetti Vecchi in Italy, wooden implements from a later Middle Pleistocene setting have been interpreted as digging sticks, made from boxwood. They preserve evidence that fire participated in shaping parts of their surfaces before scraping and finishing. They were found with large mammal remains, including straight-tusked elephants, within a wet environment that favored survival. The fire traces matter there because they are present. Their existence does not license fire hardening at Gantangqing, where the manufacturing evidence tells a different, more limited story. These comparisons resist a ranking by age. The oldest preserved construction is not necessarily the first construction made. The earliest surviving spear is not necessarily the moment wooden weapons began. The oldest East Asian assemblage is not proof that wooden tools reached the region then. Every label describes the sample, not the original invention. An older site may have vanished completely, and a younger object may continue a tradition with immense invisible depth. Archaeological firsts are discoveries at the edge of preservation, not birthdays written into human history. Geography is distorted in the same way. Europe has supplied several famous wooden weapons, partly because excavations reached waterlogged deposits in open mines and coastal sediments, where preservation and discovery aligned. African wetlands and river margins have produced different exceptions. East and Southeast Asia contain warm regions where organic decay is rapid. Acidic soils damage bone, and deep alluvium may hide ancient surfaces beyond excavation. The rarity of wooden tools there cannot be translated directly into cultural absence. Gantangqing fills one gap while exposing how many remain. The global record also cautions against assigning one material to one species. The makers at Kalambo Falls are not identified by the wood alone. Schöningen has often been placed within discussions of Middle Pleistocene European humans, but a spear cannot carry a name. Spaghetti Vecchi and Clacton belong to their regional histories. Gantangqing remains anonymous. across separate continents, populations could recognize the same elementary facts: a point concentrates force, a shaft extends reach, a hook catches what slips away, and crossed timbers can stabilize a surface. Those shared principles do not make the technologies simple. Each must be adapted to available species, moisture, grain, intended load, and the body of the user. A branch suitable for throwing may fail under levering. Dense boxwood behaves differently from pine. Construction demands joints and stable placement. Hunting demands penetration, balance, and control. Digging demands resistance to compression and twisting. Similar-looking pieces may carry different biographies, while different forms can arise from the same understanding of how wood bends, splits, and wears. Seen within this scattered record, Gantangqing changes the balance of what wooden technology means. It is not the oldest known evidence of humans working wood, and its makers did not inaugurate a global stage. Its importance comes from location, number, variety, and probable function. 35 objects from multiple layers place sustained wooden tool use within the Middle Pleistocene of East Asia. Heavy digging sticks, handheld points, hooks, and a small lozenge-shaped implement make plant-focused labor visible at scale rarely preserved. The sites across 3 continents do not join into a single unbroken tradition. Their windows opened at different heights in a building whose interior has mostly disappeared. Through one, large timbers cross above wet ground. Through another, spears lie beside an ancient shore. Elsewhere, a solitary point or fire-shaped digging stick survives. At Gantangqing, clay holds a varied toolkit close to buried plant resources. The differences matter as much as the resemblance. They show that ancient humans did not merely possess wood. They developed local wooden technologies, most of which time removed before archaeology could compare them. Those local wooden technologies are difficult to imagine because archaeology has learned to see deep time through the materials that endure. Stone survives fire, rain, burial, trampling, and the chemistry of soil better than anything people carried. It can be recovered after hundreds of thousands of years and arranged by form, raw material, manufacture, and use. Wood usually vanishes before analysis can begin. The result is not an incomplete inventory. It is a picture of human behavior tilted toward the hardest objects. This tilt begins at discovery. A scatter of flakes may emerge from an eroding section, alerting researchers that people once occupied a place. Wooden tools from the same visit may have decayed without leaving a stain. Archaeologists excavate the stone, count it, compare it, and build a technological description around what remains. The description can be accurate, yet still represent only the durable portion of the activity. Absence enters the story so quietly that it can resemble a complete toolkit. At Gantangqing, preservation interrupts that illusion. Stone artifacts are present, but the wooden objects reveal tasks that the lithics alone could not specify. Some stone edges may have been used to scrape bark, thin shafts, remove knots, or renew damaged tips. In that sense, a flake that looks modest when isolated may have participated in producing a larger implement. The visible tool was also a tool for making the invisible one, and its importance changes when the vanished material returns. This relationship cautions against treating technological categories as sealed boxes. Stone, wood, antler, bone, fiber, hide, and possible bindings could interact. Gantangqing directly demonstrates stone, antler, and worked wood, but it does not preserve every possible material, and unproven components should not be added as facts. The broader lesson comes from the confirmed association materials were selected for different properties. A cutting edge, a resilient shaft, and a hammering surface solve different parts of a task, even when only one normally survives. The phrase Stone Age therefore requires care. It remains useful as an archaeological label, especially when stone supplies most of the evidence. It should not be heard as a literal claim that people inhabited a world made primarily of stone. Trees offered reach, leverage, spring, fuel, supports, handles, and surfaces. Plants could provide fibers, coverings, food, medicine, and containers. Animal tissues supplied other flexible or durable materials. Almost all of these possibilities decay more readily than a flake, leaving stone to name an age whose textures it cannot fully represent. Preservation bias also changes which activities appear important. Hunting can become prominent when stone points, butchered bones, and dramatic concentrations of animal remains survive. Gathering plants may leave scattered residues, disturbed soil, microscopic starch, or nothing recognizable at all. A wooden digging stick has little chance of reaching the future unless waterlogging protects it. Gantangqing does not diminish hunting or animal processing. Cut-marked bones show those activities mattered. It restores another category of labor that decay often removes, making plant acquisition visible as skilled technological work. The bias may extend to who becomes visible within imagined communities. When narratives focus almost entirely on weapons and large animals, they often assign importance to a narrow range of tasks and, sometimes without evidence, to a narrow range of people. The Gantangqing tools cannot identify the age, sex, status, or relationships of their users. They do show why archaeological significance should not depend on attaching a heroic figure to an object. Digging, probing, carrying, preparing wood, and recognizing edible species could have supported everyone, regardless of how labor was divided in any particular group. What disappears is not limited to objects. A wooden technology includes choices about where suitable trees grow, when wood is easiest to work, how long it should be seasoned, which grain tolerates twisting, and how a damaged tip can be repaired. Some of these choices may be reconstructed experimentally, others leave no secure trace. Routes between raw material, working place, and resource patch disappear as well. So do gestures of teaching, rules for sharing, and memories of previous seasons. The artifact is only the hard endpoint of a knowledge system that was mostly intangible even before burial. This is why technological simplicity cannot be measured by artifact count alone. A small lithic assemblage may reflect brief occupation, limited access to stone, intensive reuse, or reliance on perishable equipment. Conversely, abundant stone does not prove that organic tools were unimportant. Each site requires its own contextual explanation. Gantangqing provides no universal formula for restoring missing wood to every deposit. It provides a warning against assuming that what survives held the same proportion in ancient life that it holds in a museum tray. Climate sharpens the distortion. In warm, humid environments, biological activity can destroy wood rapidly, while acidic soils may also damage bone. Ancient occupation in such regions can appear archaeologically thin even where people used complex equipment. Cold, dry, charred, frozen, mineralized, or permanently waterlogged settings occasionally preserve organic material, but these are exceptional pathways. The global distribution of wooden finds therefore maps favorable chemistry and excavation history as much as it maps invention. Blank areas may contain true behavioral differences, preservation failure, undiscovered deposits, or all three. Even at Gantangqing, survival is selective. 35 implements are extraordinary, but they cannot be assumed to represent the original proportions of the toolkit. Different wood species decay at different rates. Larger pieces may resist destruction or be recognized more easily than fragile fragments. Some objects floated, were carried away, or remained above the waterline. Others may lie beyond the 4 trenches. The recovered collection is a filtered sample within a filtered site, itself an exception within a continent where countless wooden objects must have disappeared. Recognizing that filter does not free interpretation from evidence, it would be easy to fill every missing space with imagined baskets, shelters, traps, handles, boats, or composite weapons. Some may have existed somewhere in Middle Pleistocene Asia, but Gantangqing does not demonstrate them. The honest reconstruction is asymmetrical. We can be confident that preservation removes much organic technology, while remaining uncertain about the exact objects removed. This restraint keeps the invisible archive scientifically meaningful. Missing evidence expands the range of possibilities. It does not make every possibility equally probable. What the site changes is the baseline of expectation. When a future excavation yields only flakes beside an ancient wetland, researchers can ask more clearly whether those edges once shaped implements that decayed. When residues or wear suggest contact with plants, gathering technology need not remain secondary to a hunting story. When a toolkit appears simple, its preservation environment becomes part of the explanation. Gantangqing cannot restore the lost wooden world, but it gives that absence a measurable form, 35 survivors showing how much human ingenuity may have stood in forests, marshes, and hands before time reduced it to stone. Once the baseline changes, familiar East Asian sites begin to look different. A deposit containing small flakes and animal bone may no longer represent a complete technological world. A lakeshore with apparently simple stoneworking may have supported activities conducted through branches, shafts, hooks, baskets, cordage, or other organic materials. Although only the first 3 are directly illuminated by Gantangqing, the discovery does not rewrite every site automatically. It changes the questions that can responsibly be asked when durable evidence appears too sparse to explain the life that produced it. For much of the Pleistocene, technological comparisons have depended heavily on stone. Researchers examine whether flakes were struck from prepared cores, whether tools were retouched, how far raw material travelled, and whether particular reduction methods appeared earlier in one region than another. These studies remain essential. Stone records real choices and can preserve sequences of action with remarkable precision. The problem arises when lithic complexity becomes a substitute for total behavioral complexity, as though every important invention had to announce itself through increasingly elaborate stone forms. Gantangqing breaks that assumed connection. Its lithic assemblage is not dominated by spectacularly standardized objects. Yet the site contains deliberately shaped wooden implements adapted to several forms of ground-level work. The contrast suggests that stone and organic technologies did not always develop along the same visible trajectory. A population could use relatively modest flakes while possessing detailed knowledge of wood, plants, seasonal wetlands, and tool maintenance. What appears conservative in stone may have been flexible when the entire material system is considered. This matters particularly in discussions of the East Asian early and Middle Paleolithic, where assemblages have sometimes been compared with more visibly elaborate stone traditions elsewhere. differences are genuine and should not be erased. Raw materials, mobility, population history, environment, and cultural transmission all affected the way stone was reduced. But a ranking based only on surviving lithics risks confusing preservation with ability. Gantangqing demonstrates that at least one Middle Pleistocene population in southwestern China invested effort in tools whose sophistication would have remained unknown if the mud had drained differently. The lesson is methodological rather than national or continental. It would be equally misleading to use Gantangqing as proof that every apparently simple East Asian assemblage concealed an identical wooden toolkit. No such toolkit has been recovered from most sites. Dry caves, open terraces, river gravels, and oxidized soils preserve different evidence from waterlogged clay. Researchers must evaluate each context individually, looking for microscopic residues, use wear, possible woodworking traces on stone edges, plant remains, and sedimentary conditions that might retain fragments or impressions. Gantangqing offers a hypothesis to test, not a template to impose. It also directs attention toward landscapes that archaeology has not always favoured. Wetlands, lake margins, floodplains, and saturated basins can be difficult places to excavate. Deposits may lie deeply buried beneath later sediment, while fluctuating groundwater complicates access and conservation. Yet these are precisely the settings where oxygen-poor conditions may protect organic objects. They were also attractive human environments, concentrating plants, animals, water, and varied raw materials. Searching such places is not merely a strategy for finding rare artifacts. It can restore activities that upland caves and exposed terraces preserve unevenly. Recovery must be followed immediately by conservation. Ancient waterlogged wood can appear solid while buried because water supports its weakened cellular structure. Once exposed, uncontrolled drying may cause shrinking, warping, cracking, or collapse. Excavators therefore document orientation, sediment, associations, and surface traces before movement, then stabilize the object through specialized treatment. Microscopic marks can be lost through careless cleaning. Residues can be contaminated through handling. The extraordinary survival of a tool for 300,000 years does not guarantee that it will survive 3 days above ground without protection. New analytical methods may recover further details. 3-dimensional scanning can record working surfaces and changing cross-sections. Microscopy can distinguish some manufacturing marks from sedimentary abrasion. Residue and starch analysis can test contact with plants, while experimental archaeology can explore how particular woods respond to scraping, levering, twisting, and repeated entry into wet soil. Chemical and anatomical study can help identify wood species. Each method narrows possibilities, but none provides direct access to intention. The strongest reconstruction comes from convergence among form, wear, residue, context, and mechanical plausibility. Experimental work is especially valuable when it remains disciplined. A replica digging stick can show that a particular shape efficiently loosens tubers and produces fractures resembling those on an archaeological specimen. That result supports an interpretation, but it does not prove that the ancient tool extracted the same species, followed the same motion, or was designed only for that purpose. Modern experimenters bring unfamiliar bodies, expectations, and objectives to the task. Experiments define what could produce the evidence. Archaeological context helps decide what probably did. Future excavations around the Lake Fuxian Basin may test whether the 35 objects represent a concentrated working area. one portion of a larger activity zone, or a small sample distributed across ancient shorelines. Additional trenches could reveal other tool forms, manufacturing debris, plant concentrations, animal processing areas, or perhaps hominin remains. They may also find nothing comparable. Preservation can vary sharply over short distances as sediments, oxygen, water flow, and microbial activity change. The absence of another collection would not make the existing one less real, but it would limit claims about how widely the behavior extended. A hominin fossil would transform one part of the mystery without solving all of it. A tooth or skull fragment might connect the occupation to a broader population, although mixed layers and uncertain associations would still require scrutiny. Ancient proteins could sometimes offer information where DNA fails, but warm, humid conditions are hostile to molecular survival. Even a secure biological identification would not reveal whether the technology belonged exclusively to that lineage. Tools can be learned, shared, independently invented, and modified across generations. Naming the maker would sharpen the history, not complete it. The more immediate change is conceptual. Gantangqing asks researchers to treat plant gathering as a technologically organized activity, organic materials as central rather than supplementary, and preservation as an active force shaping every narrative of the past. It encourages caution when intelligence is inferred from the elaborateness of stone alone. It also challenges the habit of searching for one revolutionary threshold, after which humans suddenly began planning, teaching, or adapting creatively. The wooden implements show those capacities operating through ordinary tasks, without monumental construction, symbolic objects, or a dramatic moment of invention. There is humility in that correction. 35 pieces of wood cannot restore the complete lives of the people who made them. They cannot tell us their language, appearance, social arrangements, or fate. Yet they reveal why the missing parts of prehistory cannot be treated as empty. Across ancient China, countless branches may have been sharpened, handles fitted, roots levered, shelters supported, and materials carried, only to disappear without recognition. Some possibilities remain speculative, but disappearance itself is certain. Gantangqing survived because one lakeshore briefly resisted the normal machinery of decay. Beyond the excavated trenches, the mystery therefore expands rather than closes. If skilled wooden implements were present here for repeated episodes between approximately 361,000 and 250,000 years ago, how many comparable traditions vanished elsewhere? Were these forms taught across generations, reinvented by separate visitors, or adapted continually as shorelines and resources changed? Did neighboring populations exchange techniques? Or did the physics of wood and soil guide unrelated hands towards similar solutions? The clay answers only by preserving the objects. Everything beyond them lies in the enormous silence between what ancient people made and what the earth allowed us to find. The enormous silence does not mean that every solution vanished as soon as one tool decayed. Knowledge can persist without leaving a durable object. A useful point may be copied from an older implement, a promising branch selected because previous makers learned which grain would survive twisting, and a productive patch remembered after the waterline changed. At Gantangqing, repeated wooden forms across several layers raise the possibility of technical continuity. They also expose how difficult continuity is to distinguish from repeated invention. Some shapes are guided strongly by physics. To enter soil, an end must concentrate pressure. To lever a buried organ upward, a shaft needs length, strength, and a grip that does not injure the hands. To catch something among roots, a hook is more effective than a smooth point. Separate groups facing the same materials may discover these forms independently. Similarity alone cannot demonstrate that one teacher passed a design through hundreds or thousands of generations. Yet manufacture is more than geometry. A maker must know where to find suitable wood, how green or seasoned material behaves, which knots can be tolerated, and how much outer tissue to remove without weakening the shaft. Scraping must follow or cross the grain according to the intended change. A damaged point may be shortened and renewed. These decisions are not dictated automatically by the final form. They belong to practiced knowledge, acquired through experience and potentially through observation of others. The archaeological layers cannot show the moment of teaching. No voice remains beside a scraping mark. We cannot know whether instruction was verbal, demonstrative, imitative, or divided among several kinds of learning. A novice might have watched an experienced hand rotate a branch, but that scene is a plausible illustration, not a recovered event. Gantangqing supports learned technological behavior because repeated manufacture requires dependable skills. It does not preserve the social arrangements through which those skills moved. This boundary matters when language enters the discussion. Complex tool use can be compatible with spoken explanation, coordinated planning, and shared names for woods or plants. It cannot prove any particular language system, gestures, attention, repetition, and practice can transmit many techniques, while language itself leaves no direct trace in these deposits. The wooden implements therefore contribute to debates about cognition only indirectly. They reveal controlled sequences and ecological memory, not grammar hidden inside a pointed stick. They offer no secure evidence of symbolic behavior either. There are no demonstrated carvings, decorations, ritual placements, or meaningful signs on the wood. Polish and grooves are best read through manufacture, handling, and use, unless another explanation is supported. That absence does not establish that the makers lacked symbols, stories, or ritual lives. It means Gantangqing cannot answer those questions. Practical intelligence is already significant without converting every carefully shaped object into a message. For a long time, accounts of human evolution searched for dramatic thresholds: the first true hunter, the first planner, the first teacher, or the first mind recognizable as modern. The Gantangqing assemblage fits poorly into such a sequence. It contains no sudden monument to transformation. Instead, it records repeated attention to wood, soil, plants, and changing shorelines. The capacities visible here are distributed across ordinary actions, where foresight appears as selecting a branch, and memory appears as returning to a place where food lies underground. This imbalance makes innovation difficult to see. A new form might appear once and disappear. A minor improvement might spread widely, yet leave no chronological trail because nearly every example rotted. An old design might persist for tens of thousands of years, not through cultural stagnation, but because it remained effective. Archaeologists often track change through durable sequences of stone. Wooden technology may have changed at different speeds, responding quickly to local plants and tasks while leaving only rare snapshots separated by enormous gaps. The 35 implements cannot reveal whether innovation belonged to individuals or groups. The same form may have emerged repeatedly from natural forks. Across the dated sequence, different populations could have occupied the basin and inherited nothing from one another. What appears to us as one assemblage is a compressed record in which separate episodes are brought together by excavation and classification. That compression also affects the idea of tradition. In everyday language, tradition suggests continuity of people, memory, and identity. Archaeologically, recurring forms demonstrate only that similar choices appeared more than once. To argue for a transmitted tradition, researchers would need secure chronological patterning, distinctive manufacturing conventions, and enough examples to separate cultural preference from mechanical necessity. Gantangqing provides intriguing repetition, but not a complete chain. The possibility of teaching is strong. The duration and boundaries of any specific tradition remain unknown. Even limited continuity would have required landscapes of knowledge. People needed more than isolated facts about tools. They had to recognize routes through the basin, the behavior of water, locations of stone and usable wood, signs of edible plants, and perhaps the movements of animals whose bones were processed at the site. Each visit could renew or modify that knowledge. A shore is never exactly the same after rain, sedimentation, plant growth, or seasonal retreat. Technical competence therefore included adaptation rather than the rigid repetition of a fixed design. This makes the unnamed makers easier to respect without making them falsely familiar. They solved problems through bodies, materials, and environments different from those of most people living today. Their intelligence should not be measured by whether they anticipated farming, architecture, or later civilizations. Nor should it be reduced because their stone tools appear modest. At the ancient lake, intelligence took the form of knowing what the ground concealed, how wood would respond, and when a familiar shoreline had changed enough to demand another choice. Perhaps that knowledge passed between generations. Perhaps similar solutions returned whenever new visitors encountered the same wet earth. The evidence holds both possibilities open. What it closes is the older image of Middle Pleistocene Asia as a place where simple stones exhaust the technological story. Gantangqing reveals planning without spectacle, specialization without agriculture, and skilled manufacture without a known species name. It shows culture at its most archaeologically fragile not as a monument, but as a set of remembered actions performed on materials almost guaranteed to disappear. After about 250,000 years ago, those actions leave no further wooden record in the excavated sequence. The silence may mark changing water, erosion, oxygen, occupation, or preservation rather than the end of the technology itself. Toolmakers could have moved elsewhere, altered their equipment, or continued working wood in deposits that did not protect it. The final surviving wooden implement is therefore not a last tool in any human sense. It is only the last one the known layers allow us to see, standing at the edge of another mystery. What changed when the lakeshore stopped remembering? When the lakeshore stopped remembering, it did not necessarily stop being used. The youngest Gantangqing layers containing the wooden implements date to roughly 250,000 years ago, but that boundary belongs to the excavated record, not automatically to human behavior. Above it, conditions may have changed, sediments may have been removed, or later activity may have occurred beyond the trenches. The disappearance of worked wood is real within the known sequence. The cause of that disappearance remains open. A lake margin is capable of creating such false endings. Shorelines advance and retreat. Channels cut through older surfaces, then fill with new sediment. A place that was firm enough for walking in one season can lie underwater in another and stand far from the lake centuries later. Over tens of thousands of years, small movements become a rearranged landscape. The people did not need to abandon the basin for the archaeological signal to shift beyond the narrow area where excavation eventually found it. Preservation could also fail while activity continued nearby. Wood survives only when burial is rapid enough and oxygen limited enough to slow organisms that consume it. If water levels fell, an abandoned tool might remain exposed, dry, crack, burn, or decay. If stronger currents returned, it could be transported and broken. More oxygen moving through coarser sediment would encourage destruction even after burial. A tool used in the same manner, only a short distance away, might therefore vanish while its earlier counterpart endured. Climate forms part of this changing background, though it should not be reduced to one dramatic event. The Middle Pleistocene contained repeated climatic oscillations that altered rainfall, vegetation, erosion, and water availability across East Asia. Responses around the Lake Fuxian basin would have depended on topography and hydrology, not simply on a global temperature curve. Productive wetlands might have expanded, contracted, shifted elevation, or changed species composition. Any of those changes could redirect people without producing a sudden catastrophe or an empty region. The resources themselves may have moved. Underground storage organs flourish under particular combinations of moisture, disturbance, season, and soil. If a favored patch became submerged, choked by sediment, or replaced by different vegetation, returning to the old working surface would no longer make sense. People could follow similar plants to another shore, turn toward nuts or animals, or modify their tools for new ground. The end of one excavated pattern might represent adaptation rather than lost knowledge carried onward after the place that revealed it ceased to be useful. Population history adds another possibility. Across a span exceeding 100,000 years, the basin may have received different human groups, sometimes connected and sometimes unrelated. A later population might have used the same resources with different implements, visited at another season, or organized movement across a larger territory. It may also have avoided the area entirely. Without hominin remains, genetics, or a continuous sequence of distinctive artifacts, no transition can be linked securely to the arrival, departure, replacement, or mixture of a named lineage. This prevents the silence after 250,000 years ago from becoming a story of extinction. No evidence shows that the toolmakers died at the shore, were destroyed by climate, or vanished because their technology failed. The dates cover deposits, not a biological population with known boundaries. Even if one group left the basin permanently, its members or descendants could have survived elsewhere. Archaeological disappearance is often geographic or material before it is demographic. A tradition can leave one location while the people who carried it remain alive beyond the excavated map. The site itself was assembled through a chain of transformations. A tool was made and used, then lost, discarded, or left behind. Water and sediment moved it before burial. Pressure distorted some surfaces. Minerals entered weakened tissues. Excavation separated it from the clay, and conservation prevented its collapse. Researchers then compared marks, residues, forms, and experimental damage. At every stage, information survived unevenly. What reaches us is neither a frozen day nor an untouched workshop, but a material history filtered repeatedly before it becomes evidence. That filtering explains why the assemblage should not be imagined as a single cache abandoned during an emergency. The 35 objects come from multiple layers across a long interval. There is no demonstrated flood that trapped one toolkit, no sudden flight, and no final owner whose possessions remain together. The power of the discovery lies somewhere quieter. Ordinary episodes accumulated a point overlooked in mud, a worn shaft discarded, a small implement carried by water, and perhaps a tool laid down with every intention of being retrieved. Seen this way, the youngest layer is not a closing scene but a limit of visibility. Above it, wooden technology may continue in forms the local chemistry erased. Beyond it, another shoreline may hold objects still buried. Later populations elsewhere in China almost certainly worked wood, as direct and indirect evidence from other periods suggests, but no simple line can be drawn from Gantangqing to those records. Vast gaps prevent us from tracing descent, diffusion, or continuous tradition. Similar practices on either side of silence are not automatically connected. For now, the most reliable conclusion is that three histories overlap but do not coincide. There is a history of people using the lakeshore, a history of wood being shaped and discarded, and a history of sediment deciding which objects survived. Their beginnings and endings may fall at different times. Humans could arrive before the first preserved tool and remain after the last. Woodworking could continue while local waterlogging ceased. The archaeological sequence records their intersection, a rare interval when behavior, material, and chemistry met in a form the future could recover. The question, then, changes. We no longer ask only why the tools vanished after 250,000 years ago. We ask why these 35 did not vanish with all the others. Their survival required suitable wood, deliberate manufacture, human use, abandonment in the right place, rapid protection by fine wet sediment, and hundreds of millennia without complete destruction. Discovery required trenches to cross that buried surface, and researchers to recognize shaped fragments before exposure damaged them. The assemblage is not merely old. It is the outcome of an almost uninterrupted chain of unlikely events. Night returns easily to the imagined shore, water darkens beyond reeds, damp ground closes around footprints, and a wooden point rests where a hand released it. Nothing announces that this ordinary object has entered deep history. There is no monument, inscription, or burial chamber to demand remembrance. The lake does the remembering blindly, through mud and restricted oxygen, until even the identity of the maker disappears. When the tool rises again, it carries no name and no explanation, only worked grain, soil at its tip, and the unsettling knowledge that an entire technological world may have survived in just this way once. That single survivor changes the scale of the mystery. Gantangqing is not important because one object looks unexpectedly clever, or because it can be used to crown an unknown population as the first to master wood. Its importance lies in the assemblage 35 implements recovered from several layers, 32 of them bearing evidence of deliberate modification, preserved within deposits dating from approximately 361,000 to 250,000 years ago. Together they reveal repeated technological choices across many visits rather than an isolated accident. The lakeshore preserved not a curiosity, but part of a working technology. That technology turns attention toward labor that prehistory often leaves in shadow. Heavy digging sticks could break resistant ground, smaller points could probe or loosen soil, hooked forms could work around roots and stems, residues, starch grains, wear, and fractures connect much of the assemblage with plants and earth. The exact use of every object remains uncertain, but the collection makes one conclusion difficult to avoid. Gathering plant foods could demand designed equipment, practiced movements, and detailed knowledge of a living landscape. This is a quieter kind of achievement than a successful hunt, and that may be why its significance is easy to underestimate. Yet roots, tubers, and other concealed resources must be located, recognized, extracted, processed, and sometimes revisited in the right season. A tool must withstand repeated pressure without splitting at the wrong point. What looks like a simple shaft may represent a chain of decisions extending from tree selection to the moment food leaves the ground. Its results may have supported daily survival without leaving any structure or dramatic scene behind. The discovery also restores proportion to the phrase Stone Age. Stone remains indispensable to archaeology because it survives and records manufacture so well. But it was never the only material through which humans organized their lives. At Gantangqing, stone tools existed beside worked wood, antler implements, and cut-marked animal bone. A flake might prepare a shaft, an antler billet might shape another implement, a digging stick might reach food no stone tool could obtain as efficiently. The surviving categories meet again as parts of one system. No houses, boats, farms, written signs, or monumental works have been demonstrated here. Nor does the collection prove that every Middle Pleistocene group in China carried the same forms. Its power comes from narrower claims that the evidence can sustain. Humans repeatedly selected and modified wood at this lakeshore. They used varied implements, many probably in groundworking and plant-related tasks. Their stone technology alone would have provided an incomplete description of their abilities. These conclusions are substantial precisely because they do not require imagined wonders. The makers themselves remain beyond identification. Homo erectus and other Middle Pleistocene populations belong to wider discussions of human presence in Asia. But regional possibility is not proof at one site. Gantangqing has yielded no hominin fossil, ancient DNA, or protein evidence that securely connects the tools to any lineage. The most accurate name for their makers is still human, followed by an honest silence where a species label would otherwise stand. That silence prevents an easy evolutionary lesson. The tools cannot show that one lineage became modern, crossed a cognitive threshold, or invented planning for everyone who came later. They show planning already embedded in ordinary subsistence. They cannot prove language or symbolism, yet they reveal controlled manufacture, familiarity with material properties, and memory of resources. Such competence may have been shared by populations whose bodies differed from one another and from ours. Nor can the layers tell whether one cultural tradition endured through the entire dated span. Similar forms may have been taught across generations, reinvented by later visitors, or repeatedly encouraged by the same mechanical problems. The interval is too long, the excavated area too limited, and the makers too invisible for certainty. What persists is not a proven community but a recurring relationship between people and place. When humans came to this shore, wood offered ways to reach into wet or compact soil, and skilled hands turned that possibility into tools. Their eventual disappearance from the sequence remains equally resistant to a single explanation. The shoreline may have shifted, productive vegetation moved, or people changed routes and equipment. Later deposits may have been eroded, oxygenated, or formed beyond the trenches. The absence of preserved wood after about 250,000 years ago does not prove that woodworking ended, that a population failed, or that a tradition became extinct. It marks where the known conjunction of behavior, burial, and chemistry no longer leaves the same evidence. This is perhaps the deepest legacy of Gantangqing. The archaeological record is not merely incomplete in quantity, it is uneven in character. It favours stone over wood, exposed bone over vanished plants, and activities that produce durable debris over those conducted with biodegradable materials. Entire categories of work can shrink until they appear marginal. Entire technologies can disappear until their makers seem less capable. A waterlogged pocket can reverse that illusion by returning a few objects that should ordinarily have become soil. Future discoveries may enlarge the picture. Other trenches around the basin could reveal additional forms, manufacturing areas, plant concentrations, or even remains of the people themselves. Comparable waterlogged sites may wait beneath floodplains and lake margins elsewhere in Asia. Improved microscopy, residue analysis, imaging, and conservation may recover invisible details. Yet new evidence may also deepen disagreement, showing that the toolkit was more varied than imagined, or that similar implements served different purposes. Good archaeology does not promise that every mystery will narrow into one answer. What Gantangqing already provides is enough. Around 300,000 years ago, expressed as a rounded age for a sequence extending much farther on either side. Humans in what is now southwestern China worked wood deliberately and repeatedly. They selected branches and trunks, shaped tips, created hooks, used tools against earth and plants, processed animals, and returned to a resource-rich lakeshore. They were neither named ancestors waiting to become us nor anonymous shadows without skill. They saw people living successfully within a world whose ordinary materials almost completely escaped preservation. The phrase that these tools should have vanished is therefore more than a dramatic description. Under normal conditions, they would have fungi, insects, oxygen, water movement, pressure, and time would have dismantled their cells until no recognizable implement remained. Had that happened, the site might still have yielded stone and bone, and a much thinner story would have appeared complete. Instead, fine, wet sediment interrupted decay. It did not preserve the whole world. It preserved enough to demonstrate that the missing world was real, and that its absence has shaped how we imagine the human past. Now the ancient shore can grow quiet again. The hands have withdrawn, and the names of the plants have vanished with the language in which they were learned. Water lies close to the reeds. Beyond it, dark slopes hold the last light, while damp earth bears the shallow marks of feet that will soon be softened by rain. Near the margin rests a length of shaped wood. Its point is worn, its surface scraped, and traces of soil remain where it entered the ground. It may have been dropped, discarded, or set aside for a return that never came. Stone nearby will endure, but the fibres of the shaft already belong to moisture and decay. Then sediment settles, fine particles close around the grain, excluding just enough oxygen to slow the ordinary work of disappearance. Seasons pass above it, the shoreline moves, vegetation changes, and generations cross nameless landscapes. Thousands of years become tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands. The tool does not remember its maker, but it keeps the pressure of manufacture in its surface. When it's uncovered, the vanished shore returns only in fragments. There is no face, no voice, and no single answer to the question of who stood here. There are worked points, hooks, heavy shafts, stone edges, antler, bone, starch, clay, and the patient limits of inference. They are enough to show knowledge, not enough to restore a life. The distance between those truths is where the mystery remains. And so the wooden tools of Gantangqing settle into human history without ending it. They ask us to imagine the past with less confidence in what survives and more respect for what does not. Beneath the old lakeshore, Fragile wood outlasted every spoken memory of the people who shaped it. For one improbable interval, mud held back time. In the darkness below the changing water, the tools waited without purpose, owners or story, until they rose into ours. Far beyond the trenches, other wooden worlds may still lie buried, or may have disappeared so completely that no discovery can call them back. Night gathers over Lake Fuxian, as it has through ages no human calendar can contain. Water touches earth, reeds bend, and the shore becomes still. What endured rests quietly beside what was lost, and in that stillness the Stone Age is filled once more with trees, roots, careful hands, and all the vanished things that once seemed certain to remain.